Good evening. This is Donna Blomquist, librarian at the LaSalle Public Library. Welcome to tonight's virtual program, Depicting the Divine, Part 2. Before we begin, just a few programming reminders. On Tuesday, October 4th at 6:30 Central Time, join us virtually for Scone Zone with Father Dominic. In this presentation, Father Dom will present the history of scones from medieval times to the present and will include basic techniques for a classic scone recipe with easy variations and some more advanced recipes like Norfolk scones with a layer of raspberry filling and savory scones with bacon, cheddar, and chives. These recipes are all from Father Dom's new cookbook. On Wednesday, October 12th at 7 p.m. Central Time, the library will join libraries across the state in virtually hosting award-winning author Jesmyn Ward for a conversation on how her literary vision and personal experiences address urgent questions about racism and social injustice. Ward, hailed as the new Toni Morrison by the American Booksellers Association, is the author of fiction, nonfiction, and memoir, including the critically acclaimed novels Sing, Unburied, and Salvage the Bones, and the memoir Men We Reaped. And on Tuesday, October 18th at 6 p.m. Central, please join us for Windjammers, Sternwheelers, and Tin Stackers, Working Waterways of Illinois. Folk musician and balladeer Lee Murdoch will be live for a virtual concert telling the stories and histories of commerce on the rivers, canals, and Lake Michigan's Illinois shoreline, tracing shipping in this state from the days of keelboats through today's 1,000-foot lake freighters. Hear the history through the voices of river rats, schoonermen, lighthouse keepers, and fisher folk, modern sailor, and the environmentalists. A night of music and storytelling. We are very excited to have Lee Murdoch back with us. We hope you will join us for this virtual live concert. And as always, library programming is free and open to the public. It is also shareable, so please feel free to pass the information on to others. We also want to hear from you tonight. Please post your questions for tonight's program in the chat. And tonight, we are welcoming back artist and art historian Laura Mueller for her presentation, Depicting the Divine, Part 2. What does the divine look like in female form? Part 1 of this presentation can be found on the LaSalle Public Library website in the recorded archives. And now, Laura, are you there?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and we are going to stop sharing our screen, and there you are. Excellent, okay. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so tonight we look at goddesses. And when I chose this topic, I chose it partly because in my last presentation a year ago, I couldn't fit in all of the deities that I wanted to. And I realized that women were sort of underrepresented, at least. Although a few of the ones I'm going to talk about tonight may have been at least referred to in the last talk. But I didn't realize how complicated an issue this would be because there are several controversies involved with the study of goddesses. So I'm going to try to take a middle route. I'm going to try to present things as objectively as I can. And I wanted to tell you that the presentation tonight, the order of the slides is not strictly chronological, because here I am starting with a Renaissance image by Botticelli of the Birth of Venus, a painting that is probably quite familiar to you. But we're going to go back in time very quickly after that, and I'll jump around a little. Largely, I'm moving forward from a point in the distant past towards the present, but there are some jogs because I wanted to do thematic comparisons of goddesses. So some things are a little bit out of place in a strict timeline sense. I also wanted to mention, as you see here, that I'm going to include some goddesses that I think will be familiar to you if you remember studying Greek and Roman mythology in school, as I did. So Venus here, or Aphrodite, her other name, her Greek name, is the goddess of love, as you probably all know. And there's a famous story about how she was born from the sea, sort of born.
Laura, excuse me. Let me just stop you right there. We're not seeing your screen.
Oh, you're not seeing it
yet? We're seeing you, but we're not seeing your slides.
Oh, okay. Thank you for telling me. Oops, wait a minute. Let me go back.
But we're all following along. We're good.
Okay. So let's do play. And actually, this is not what I wanted to show you. I have to go backwards. There she is. Now, do you see her?
No, I still see you.
Really? Okay, hold on.
How about share screen, the green button?
Oh, yes. Okay. Down at the bottom. And then I'm going to have to pull her back into place. There we go.
And there we see her coming up. Now we need to go full screen
Right. So I will
on
go
your
to
slides.
play. It will let me play.
And
Now,
there it is.
there she is. So I hope she is familiar to you. We're not going to spend a lot of time on her, but as I said, this is the goddess of love who has several counterparts among the goddesses we're going to look at tonight. But Venus gives her name to a much older group of goddesses. Oh, and it can be debated whether these are goddesses at all. So one of the questions that's going to come up right away in this talk is, why is it important to think about how artists have depicted the divine, in this case, how they've depicted goddesses? And in some cases, the answer is because we may be looking at a culture so old that it gives us no written records, so we have nothing to refer to. So when we have to decide, when we look at this Venus of Lozelle, which is what modern people have called her, we have to figure out, is this a representation of a woman from prehistoric times? This is from a shelter, a rock shelter that was very near the cave, the famous cave of Lascaux, where the paintings of the animals are. It's right in that area. And it's very old. It's from 20,000, somewhere between 20,000 and 18,000 BC. So obviously there's no written material to go with her. And all we can go on here is what we see. Now, I can tell you that this image was carved on a curving rock face, so that her belly, which is quite emphasized in the way the figure has been portrayed here, becomes very important. So there's some speculation that maybe she is pregnant, or that the artist is referring to woman's capacity to give birth. Because as we look at goddesses, that's one of the things that women come to prominence about. I mean, the ability of women to give birth must have seemed a true mystery long ago. And so we have ancient peoples trying to deal with this mystery. Now, the other thing that's important, well, there are a couple of things. You may notice the little traces of red on her. This whole thing was painted with red ochre originally. So she would have been more exaggerated, more exotic looking. And in her hand, one hand is on the belly, sort of over where the womb would be. The other arm holds up a buffalo horn, and buffaloes make their way into a lot of goddess stories, strangely enough. But this one is remarkable, they think, because of these little notches that have been carved in it, 13 notches. So the archaeologists who look at this speculate that maybe this, because it's shaped like a cyclical, a little slice of the moon, a crescent moon, the horn, that it may refer to the waxing days of the moon. Or it may be a kind of calendar. It may be her way of keeping track of her menstrual cycle. Or it might even be a notation for a totally different reason, something having to do with marking time passing and when animals would be back in the area to be hunted and provide food. Because of course, along with giving birth, a woman is often associated, not always, of course, but often associated with providing the food for the family, or preparing it at least. So let's go forward a little bit. So I thought this would be an interesting comparison. This is something from the 17th century, a print by a Dutch artist, Jost Amen, of the goddess Diana, the Roman goddess Diana, as a moon goddess. And you notice that she too holds a crescent moon and is sort of flying through the sky on a kind of crescent-shaped boat, I guess. But we'll see Diana, who's also known as Artemis, later in the program. And you may remember from your own encounters with Greek mythology, that she was a goddess of hunting and often would be out at night hunting. But she was also associated, because of being out at night, associated with the moon and the phases of the moon. Now, these two little ones are part of a sand painting done by a Navajo artist very recently, comparatively speaking, in 1940. And the name of this gives you a hint at the sort of ancient origins of the subject matter in this sand painting. In sand painting, different materials, different sands, if you like, are colored, and then they are put in place. You may have seen demonstrations of this, to make a picture without using, say, wet paint. It's done by arranging the colors. So we have two figures here. On the left, there's a male, and on the right, there's a female. And one would be hard pressed to be able to distinguish them unless one knew what Native Americans often point out to. And they often associate, and not all Native American groups do, but often the ancient ones associate the male figure with the sky. So this is supposed to be Father Sky, in the words of the 1940s artist. And the woman is on the side. The goddess is Mother Earth. Now, how do we know there's sky and earth? Well, you probably see these little spots on the male figure, and as well as a moon and a sun notation. So we're looking up at the sky. He's part of what makes our world. And the other part that's necessary is the earth, which we stand upon and which gives us nourishment. So the goddess has various plants that would be used to feed her peoples, like squash plant, bean, corn, and also, interestingly, tobacco plants as a necessary plant. So she is giving the people the things that they require. If you wonder about the rest of the iconography here, what are all these symbols? This little symbol up here is supposed to be a bat, who's supposed to be a protective animal for the goddess. And the god has a little pouch in which he keeps his magical incantations, which is up above his head. So there are meanings for the various parts of the rest of the picture. In fact, I believe this is the part that they refer to as the rainbow, which sort of locates them in a celestial sky, if you would. Now, since we're dealing with personifications and we just talked about the sky, I had to include the goddess Nut from Egypt. And you're seeing her here painted on a ceiling of a tomb. Nut was one of the very primordial goddesses or gods of Egypt. And she was the sky goddess. Now, originally, she was born sort of plastered on top of the god who stood for earth. So you notice the male and female have reverse positions here. We saw Mother Earth before, now we're seeing sort of Mother Sky and Father Earth. And often they're shown separated by another being. Here, they're separated by the process through the sky of the sunboat. But Nut is shown in this strange position because she cannot be flat on the earth. There needs to be space or atmosphere or room for people to stand between the sky and the earth. Nevertheless, they're closely intertwined. So the Native American idea is not that different from the Egyptians, just that the sexes have reversed places. Now, we can also have things like rivers being personified. Here in a piece from India from the 9th or 10th century, we have the main figure, the largest figure, standing for the river Yamuna, which is one of the great rivers of India. Again, it brings people the things they need. It fertilizes the land. And the other figures standing with her, along with what I think is a duck there, are a turtle. She's standing on top of a turtle, so all these watery creatures. She has two attendants, one of whom is holding an umbrella over her to symbolize to people who know Indian art that this is a goddess. She's sheltered from the sun by this umbrella. And then we have over here her father, who's supposed to be bearded, although it's hard to see. I think he has a mustache, certainly. But even he is not carved to be as big as she is, because this is a piece about the goddess Yamuna. Now, if we go forward one more, we get to an older piece from maybe around the 1400s, 1400s BC. This is from Babylonia. And the strange look of it is created by the fact that this piece of art, these sculptures, were made out of bricks that were molded into shapes. So once again, if you look carefully, you'll see there's a male god with little horns there. And the woman also, the goddess also has a horned headdress, because in Sumer and in various areas near the Tigris and Euphrates, the Fertile Crescent, a horned crown, and often it's a stacked horned crown, is a sign that we're looking at not just human beings, but at God and goddess. In this case, I wonder if, I wish I could talk to you about it just to see how you interpret it. But I can tell you that what the archaeologists make of this is that this is a mountain god, and this is a goddess of water, flowing water, so that the god brings water down from the mountain, and we see sort of trickling rivulets of water carved in the brick here, and brings the water down to the rivers and the water sources, which are represented by the goddess. Now, interestingly, both of these figures, male and female, are said to be found as they're identified from their temple as being both part of a goddess whose name was Inanna. So now when we get to Inanna, I can tell you a story. And I think the story will help. With the Venus of Lozelle, we don't know what the story was, but the text of stories about Inanna were finally translated. Some of them are fragmentary, some of them are complete, but they were finally translated in the 20th century. So now we know a lot more about who Inanna was, and I can tell you a story about her. So this is a little figure of Inanna from one of her temples. She's going to look odd to you because her eyes are missing. If you've ever been to the Oriental Institute in Chicago, which was supposed to be where Indiana Jones worked as an archaeologist, you'll know that a lot of these little figurines that they have there have inset eyes. Often blue or black stones that are very beautiful are put in to stand for the eyes. But this poor goddess, not through any story, but through the passage of time from when this was made, which was maybe around 2500 BC, she's lost the stones that were her eyes. But we have here a picture or a statue of a young goddess, Inanna, but one who it turns out is very powerful. In fact, of all the goddesses I'm going to talk about tonight, I think in a way, she comes closest to the concept of a main goddess instead of a main god, of a religion, and this would be the religion in Sumer in the Near East, where maybe Inanna held sway the way Zeus would hold court in the Greek pantheon or in Roman. So Inanna was originally, in the early stories, is just a young woman who's sort of finding her way. She sometimes resorts to trickery. For instance, she goes to the god of wisdom, and there are gods in the system, but she, a young, inexperienced goddess, manages to trick him by getting him to drink with her. And after he's drunk, she gets him to give her the secrets of culture, which she can pass on to her people. Some people think this story has to do with the center of the religion moving from the city of Enki, who was the god of wisdom, to the city of Inanna, which was now going to become the prominent city in the country. So that's an early story about Inanna, but we have many others. For instance, here on what is called the Warka vase, which is much longer than you see it. It's a long, somewhat cylindrical shaped vase that's all full of relief sculpture. We have a very young Inanna still, and she's wearing a kind of different gown here than you're going to see on her usually. She's making some kind of ritual gesture with her thumb. You notice there's that strange gesture with the fingers bent and the thumb up. And she seems to be, the way it's interpreted is that she's accepting gifts from a suitor. Now, what the story goes that it took Inanna's brother to clue her in that maybe it was time for her to seek a husband. And he pestered her about it over and over again. he wanted her to marry a shepherd whose name was Dumuzi or Dumuzid. In other versions of this story, he's called Tammuz. So if that name is familiar to you, Dumuzi and Dumuzid are basically the same character, a shepherd. But Inanna is her own person. She says, no, brother, I think I'm in love with a farmer. And so there's a long part of the story in which the brother convinces her that a shepherd would bring her better material things than the farmer. So she's persuaded to accept these gifts and to meet Dumuzi. Now, unfortunately, Dumuzi was on this vessel, but it's been broken over the years. You can see the cracks. And I couldn't show you, I couldn't even find a picture of him on this vase, but he is behind this gift bearer who goes ahead of him as a kind of servant. And he so dazzles Inanna, who has no experience of sex, that she has this wild infatuation with him when she meets him. And there's erotic poetry about the way she feels about him. So they get together, and since she's a goddess, she can allow him to sit on her throne. And he finds that very comfortable. In fact, he starts acting like he's the main character. Although he's not a god, he acts as if he's the king of the city. And so there's this, some of this is lost because there are various texts, and we don't have this story of how their relationship devolved after they consummated it. So we have to sort of jump ahead to the next installment, which was called Inanna's Descent into the Underworld. And for this, I'm showing you a priestess of Inanna. Notice the elaborate outfit that she wears. And we think that this is sort of, imitative of what they would have imagined their goddess to wear. And she would have had jewels, she would have had a crown, she would have had these layered flounced garments that you see here on the priestess. Now, I mentioned I'm going to read a little bit of the translation, so don't think I'm just being repetitive. The repetitive nature of what I'm going to read you is part of the storytellers. It's like little tricks that storytellers use to remind themselves to memorize the stories. And it also sort of sets up Inanna's journey into the land of the dead. From the great above, she set her mind towards the great below. The goddess from the great above, she set her mind towards the great below. Inanna from the great above, she set her mind towards the great below. My lady abandoned heaven, abandoned earth. To the netherworld she descended. Inanna abandoned heaven, abandoned earth. To the netherworld she descended. Abandoned lordship, abandoned ladyship. To the netherworld she descended. Now, from the rest of this text, we don't think that she's going down because she's died. We think she's trying to break the rules and get into the underworld and to get back. Because as she prepares for this journey to the underworld, she tells her, and I want to call her a right-hand man, but it was a right-hand woman, her prime minister, if you would. Listen, I'm going down to see my sister who rules the underworld. If I don't come back in 3 days, I want you to go to the gods of the earth and have them rescue me, just in case I can't come back, but I think I'm going to come back. Now, of course, when she goes to the gates of the underworld and knocks very boldly on the gates, the gatekeeper says, you can't come in. And if you come in, you'll never get out again. And she says, let me in, let me in. She's very insistent, very impetuous young woman. So the gatekeeper goes to her sister, whose name is Ereshkigal, and says, this very well-dressed woman has come to the gates, and she says, she's your sister, and she wants to come down into the underworld. So the text says, Ereshkigal slapped her thigh and bit her fingernails and thought, and she said, let the doors open just a little bit, but each threshold she crosses, she has to give up something. So there's this long story of, basically, it's of the denuding of Inanna. First, she gives up her beautiful lapis lazuli necklace, and then and she questions it. She says to the gatekeeper, why do I have to do this? And he says, quiet, Inanna, the ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. So it's sort of like the young person being showed her place in the world. She thought she could conquer everything. And she gradually loses her crown, her veil, her shawl, and then eventually her dress. So that after she's gone through the 7 thresholds getting into the underworld, she is nude. And we might imagine that she looks like this figure. This figure, which was made of clay and has such a beautiful, voluptuous body, but very odd things like wings and bird's claws. This figure has never been firmly identified because there's no text. It could be Inanna herself, and I think it is, especially because she's nude. But it could be her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld. After all, there are symbols here of owls, like the nightly creatures, and in the underworld, it's dark. But there are also Inanna's creatures, her lions on which she's standing, which support her, which show her fierce side. So when Inanna gets to the underworld, you'd think she would be embarrassed because she's nude, but no, she goes and tries to sit on her sister's throne, which infuriates her sister. And her sister looks at her with the eye of death, and suddenly Inanna dies. And in the very gruesome scene, the sister takes her corpse and hangs it up on a hook as if it were in a butcher's shop in the underworld. So 3 days go by and Inanna is missing from the world and things are starting to die. This is sort of like the story of Persephone, which I'll try to tell you later, but you probably know. And so Inanna's good secondhand person goes to the gods, even to Enki, whom Inanna had tricked, and says, Inanna has not come back. I don't know what to do. So Enki says, he's the one god who agrees to do something. And he says, I will send my minions down to the underworld, and I'm going to try to get Inanna back alive. So the minions go to Ereshkigal, and she likes them because she's been having pregnancy pains. And the minions express sympathy for her, unlike Inanna, who didn't care to even greet her sister. So she's actually convinced by this to allow the minions to take Inanna's body down and to bring it back to life and to slowly crawl back through the 7 thresholds, recovering her pieces of clothing and jewelry as she goes. But demons pursue her as she's leaving the underworld because nobody leaves the underworld without consequences. And they say to her, okay, we're going to let you go, but you have to send someone to take your place because there's an open spot now in the underworld. When she gets up to her own realm, to Earth, the demons are still following her and they suggest, hey, how about your prime minister? Why don't you send her down? And she goes, no, look, she did everything to rescue me. I'm not going to do that to her. And they go to several other of the servants and suggest that Inanna send them. And Inanna says, no, look, they've been mourning for me. They've been weeping. Then they go to the throne room with her, where she goes to retake her own throne. And who is there but Dumuzi, her husband? And he's being entertained by slave girls and seemingly not missing Inanna at all, seems to be unaware that she was even gone. So Inanna flies into a fury and she tells the demons, you can take him. And now there's a further part of the story that happens. Dumuzi is terrified when he hears this, and he tries to consult his sister, who is a good sister. And the sister says to him, look, let's try to make a deal with Inanna. I am willing to go to the underworld and take 6 months of the year so that you can be up on Earth 6 months of the time and I'll be down the other 6 months. And by this time, Inanna is sort of feeling bad about what she's done to her husband. So she says, okay. So the story is that the husband is the figure that dies and comes back to life. Now, Inanna herself did this, as you can tell from the story, but Tammuz or Dumuzi becomes the famous revived character. And often they say that this is a pattern that goddesses form. Powerful goddess, a weaker man, and the man dies and then is brought back to life. Now here's one final headless statue of Inanna. I wanted to point out again the lions that are on, you can only see one side of her throne, but you see that there's a lion here, and I can tell you there's a lion, a matching lion on the other side. If you look way down at the bottom, I don't know if you can see it, There are little rosettes, which are one of her symbols, but there are also lions crawling beneath her to show that often she rides a lion throne, but not into the underworld. So we have now Inanna resurrected, and I want to compare her with a culture that's even older than Inanna's, if you can, take that into your minds. Inanna goes back quite a ways, but this is a culture that has left no written record at all. As far as we know, they did not have writing. And this is the culture that's called Çatalhöyük, which is a Turkish name given to this ancient city that was found in Anatolia or Turkey. It was found only in the 1960s by an archaeologist named James Mueller, who was fascinated by it. And, if I had a lot of time, I could tell you, maybe you've even seen programs about this. It's a sort of fascinating settlement in which there are no spaces between the houses, and each little apartment or house is sort of set up architecturally in the same way. To get from one house to another, you have to climb a ladder and walk across the roof to get to your neighbor's house. But in one of the houses, in a grain bin, because part of the house was always devoted to preparation of food and storage of food, they found this little statue. And there's a lot of controversy. I'm going to call it a goddess, because that's what the archaeologist who first found it felt it was. But people challenge this now. So I can tell you right away that we're not seeing it as it was when he found it, because her head was missing, and the head of this little lion, who looks a little like a cub, this head was also missing. So they were restored by the museum that took this piece in Turkey that displays it. It's a very, very old. 5,800 BC is the estimate for when this little clay sculpture was done. Now, the interpretation of it has always puzzled me, because they say she may be giving birth. And I've seen this quoted by various experts. To me, she doesn't look as though she's giving birth, unless this is the child's head. Obviously, her stomach is distended, and she might be pregnant. Maybe this is supposed to be the child's head coming out. I can't quite imagine that, but they say it quite confidently. And I think part of that idea comes from their excavation of the rooms that were around her. But also, I should point out that this woman is sitting on a chair or a throne of sorts, because chairs were not that common in ancient times. So you'd have to be someone powerful, like a ruler or a goddess, perhaps, to have a chair of your own. Plus, she has two animals at her sides, and probably her arms, which are now broken, were once resting on their heads or on their shoulders, as if they were under her control. They are her guardians, but they're also her creatures. So they often interpret this as her being a mistress of the animals, which was one of the titles given to goddesses at that time. Now, this strange, I can't show you a photograph of the little rooms, but I can quickly say, this is one of the strange little rooms that they found in Çatalhöyük. And the idea that the figure is giving birth may come from this feature on the wall. Now, the artist who drew this has made it look like a person, although there are little animal ears on it. And because the legs are spread and there are bull's craniums underneath this figure, they hypothesize that this is a figure of a goddess giving birth to animals. And then we already had the association of that figure with the lion sitting next to her. But beyond this, I mean, even this is speculation. I heard a more recent archaeologist poo-poo this whole thing and say, oh no, this is a bear skin. And really, it could be various things. The shape is very abstracted, although it does seem to be a being that has two arms and two legs and a head, and seemingly a belly button. So I won't go on and on about Çatalhöyük because there's so much speculation about it, but it is one of the places that people thought might have been devoted to a goddess rather than to a god, because there were these female statues found there, and because of the imagery on the walls. But we can't say for sure. This also reminds me that without a text, without a language, the interpretation of the look of the piece becomes so important. Let me go backwards too. For instance, we have her here sitting on a throne with animals by either side. If we look at this piece, which we know from translated texts is Astarte, again, a Near Eastern goddess, we have a kind of reference. Oh, maybe goddesses are the people who sit on the thrones and have accompanying animals. In this case, they're sphinxes, so they have human heads, but lion bodies and wings like a bird. And this tradition continues in other cultures. This is a Celtic piece from Germany from a much later date. I think it's from the beginning of the years following the BC. So we used to call them AD. Now it's, I forget the new definition, but this is Epona, we know this from texts, who was a Celtic goddess who was a horse goddess. So these two creatures, which are somewhat hard to identify, are supposed to be ponies. In other statues we have of her, she is next to horses. And she was a Celtic goddess who appealed to the Romans who were fighting with the Celts and sometimes conquering the Celts, because a lot of them had horses and were riders. And she seemed to be somewhat warlike, although you can see on her lap, she has food for them to eat. So again, we see her as this pattern of the goddess who takes care of the animals, a mistress of the animals. And here is, if we had her head, which should be more recognizable, but this is Artemis, the Greek goddess that we talked about a little bit earlier, the goddess of the moon, the goddess of the hunt. Sometimes the goddesses who are goddesses of animals hold the animals either by the neck or here by their paws. But Artemis, surprisingly, she's a hunter goddess, but she's also a protector of animals. So she makes sure, if you want to reason it out, she makes sure that you don't hunt down baby animals or animals that are suffering, that the animals that are hunted for food. So it's odd because she's both a protector as well as a killer of animals. And in fact, I have this little sidetrack now on Artemis, or Diana, as she was called by the Romans. Artemis isn't always as still as you see her here in this very frontal symmetrical presentation. Very often, Artemis can be identified by the fact that she's running or moving, running through the forest. And when people analyze her, experts on myth, they say she was almost like a goddess of the wild. She wasn't a warlike goddess per se. She was interested in hunting, and that's why she's carrying her bow. This is a piece by an American artist from the 20th century, actually, by Frederick McMonnies. But he encapsulates a lot of the views of Diana. For instance, here in a Renaissance painting by Titian, we see Diana or Artemis running through the forest with her bow, and we see her hunting down a hunter himself, Actaeon. Now, you may know this story, but I'll try to tell it quickly. Actaeon had been wandering around the forest looking for game, and his hunting dogs were with him. He chanced to come upon a stream, which you see back here, where Artemis was taking a break from her hunting with all her nymphs, and they were all taking a bath in the water, so they were nude. Diana or Artemis looks up and she sees a man has seen her nude, and Diana is a virginal goddess devoted to her virginity. So she flies into a fury and curses him, in a sense. Usually she's shown at that moment holding up her hand to point at him, saying, "You think you're going to tell others that you've seen this? Try it." And she turns him from hunter into the hunted. So if you look carefully, his head is becoming a deer's head. And poor Actaeon is no longer able to speak, although the myth tells us that he still has human consciousness. He tries to signal to his dogs that they should not attack him, but they do, and they kill him. So I remember talking about this myth once to a classroom of children, and one of the boys said to me, But that's just not fair. He didn't mean to see her. He didn't mean to commit this crime. But as you may know, goddesses and gods act sometimes in irrational and high-handed ways, and that's what Artemis does here. And we see her again on this image that you saw advertising the talk. Here on a Greek vase, she is shooting Actaeon down, although she hardly needs to because his dogs are all over him, biting him and tearing him to bits. But you have this dramatic confrontation of the standing goddess and the falling and dying human man, the hunter, not protected by her seemingly, even though she's the goddess of hunting. Now here's a much more mellow goddess. She is a Mycenaean goddess. Now, Mycenae was, yes, it's part of Greece now, but Mycenae dates to a time before the Greek gods that we know, like Diana or Artemis, were prominent. Mycenae was a very early time, and after it failed as a civilization, there were dark ages in which a lot of the skills of artists were lost and had to be recovered. When we went back to the classical Greek age, it was also a time when stories may have been lost. But here we have, once again, if you notice the signs, a goddess feeding with some kind of plant life, these two goats that are what we would call goats rampant, because sometimes you see on shields, you see these in heraldry, that the animals are upright as they were in the picture of Artemis. But we don't think this is Artemis. From her clothing, we would say this is not even a Mycenaean woman. And I'm going to show you the culture they think originated this very lively goddess. Notice she has a different sense, even though she's a central figure and it's very symmetrical, there's a sense that she's moving and maybe even dancing. I mean, you have this frontal body and then the feet going sideways and the big skirt is waving around. She comes, we think, from a culture that whose art was very much about liveliness and movement. And that was the culture on Crete, an island separated from the Greek mainland, and an enemy, or at least a trading enemy of the Mycenaeans. This is a famous relief of ladies on Crete. Now, Crete had a culture that was just as ancient as Mycenae, maybe more ancient. And in fact, Crete may have influenced the Mycenaean Greek mainland culture. But here we come up with the usual question: are these just fashionable ladies enjoying life, or are these goddesses? And we cannot answer it because the written script, now Crete did have written language. It had linear A and linear B. In the 20th century, linear B was deciphered and it was found to be a very, very ancient form of Greek. But when they tried to use the same techniques with linear A to find out what the stories of all these goddesses and creatures on the island of Crete were, nobody's been able to crack the code successfully of linear A. It seems to be a non-Greek language. So again, we're faced with a culture where all we have is the visual evidence. So most archaeologists, most experts say these are fashionable ladies of a culture that was called Minoan by the man who discovered it, Sir Arthur Evans. He was the one who excavated it. He actually bought the land on which the fabulous palace of Knossos was. And this is a fresco from the palace that was removed from the wall. You may recognize this figure. She's a very famous figure in art history. She's called normally the snake goddess of the Minoan culture. She was found in a pit, again, with other broken pieces. She herself was broken. As you might notice, her arm is broken here. This arm was missing and had to be reconstructed to be like the other arm. Both arms are holding snakes. And her head was okay, but her crown, if she ever had one, was broken off. And this little cat-like animal, lion or cat, these two things were actually put on here by Sir Arthur Evans and his assistant. They found these pieces with the broken snake goddess in this pit. And they felt, well, the crown does look like pictures that we see on the walls where the people are wearing flowers on their head. So let's give her a flowered crown. I don't know where they came up with the idea of the cat. So I'm not even going to try to analyze the cat. The snakes are another matter, though, because she was holding at least one snake. And as you'll see in the next picture, another piece of another clay sculpture that came from this pit. This is a goddess, or a woman perhaps, who has snakes crawling all over her, up her crown and around it. And notice it's sort of a high towered crown like Inanna's. Snakes coming down here. You notice that the fashion for Crete, whether you see the fashionable ladies or somebody that we assume might be a goddess, the fashion was very tight wasp waist, a little sort of bolero bodice, but no worries about showing the breasts. The breasts are usually displayed. Now, we don't know if this was just like a fashion statement that happened or if this is the way women dressed all the time, but all the visual evidence we have shows women dressed like this. And so we're left with the question was, were these goddesses? Were they dealing with snakes because snakes are associated with the underworld, which is the world of mysteries of death that come out of the earth? Or were the snakes possibly protective deities as they are in Lithuania? And I think even I read in Ireland, in ancient Ireland, it was thought that you would invite a snake into your house, believe it or not, by having a little dish of milk for it to lap from, because it would serve as a protector for your house. Now, to show you more of the problems in dealing with the Minoan culture or the culture on Crete, this was one of the big frescoes along a hallway, and it's clearly a processional because this is the part of it, this lower part, that was left after various earthquakes hit the island of Crete. And we think eventually it was an earthquake and a tsunami that ended the very high culture that existed there because there's a dying off. So a lot of this is reconstruction. And when we talk about or consider whether there might have been a goddess or a queen, some people say, okay, maybe it wasn't a goddess, but maybe it was a matriarchy ruled by a woman. The evidence would be this. We don't know, oops, I didn't mean to do that. We don't know what all these people were holding. We know what this figure was holding, that he was holding a jar with liquid in it because his head and his arm and the jar are left. It's original fresco. The rest of it was in pieces. So some of this may be reconstructed from pieces, but what they're assuming is that all the legs this are pointing towards this skirt and all the legs over here are pointing towards this side of this figure. So there's something about her that is unique. She might be a queen, she might be a goddess, but we may be witnessing a feminine dominated culture. Now, Sir Arthur Evans went much further than I'm going, and he said, I think it was a peaceful culture because women ruled it. And there was no evidence that there were fortifications. Of course, they were on an island, so maybe they didn't need fortifications. But he made big claims for the culture. And he said, and there is a sense when you look at Minoan art of feeling for beauty and for natural spaces. They think if religions were practiced there, it was up on a mountaintop outside, not in a temple. And they think that maybe these little figures were found in a pit, possibly because there was an earlier earthquake that we know about for sure that had ruined the palace of Knossos once. And that maybe the figures were put in a pit in the floor of the new palace when it was rebuilt to sort of give continuity to the old gods and goddesses who were there. Now, here we have another figure that's ostensibly Mycenaean because it was found on the mainland of Greece. But again, the outfits do not go with the fashion that we know existed in Mycenae. These are the outfits that Minoan women would wear. And there's a lot of speculation about whether these two might be either friends or maybe a mother-daughter pair. I know this image is hard to interpret, and it's a very small ivory sculpture. But if you look carefully, you'll see that this woman's arm was broken, but it actually extended down into a little hand. And she's helping a little boy, seemingly like toddler age, maybe learning how to walk while the other woman looks on. And they embrace one another. There was a shawl over both their shoulders. a lot of people think this could be either a mother and daughter, and the daughter is the mother of the child, or possibly a mother goddess and a daughter goddess, because such combinations exist. For instance, here. This is a much later piece, but from ancient Greece, after the Dark Ages, when they recovered, their skills and even went further with their skills. We think this image of these two women, it's such a tender, sort of sweet, loving image. They think it's a family image. They think this is the mother and this is the daughter, and that maybe it's a very famous mother and daughter pair, that this might be Demeter or Ceres, who was the earth goddess, the goddess of fertility, and her daughter Persephone, who was stolen away from her in this horrible incident, which I'm sure you've heard of. Pluto, the god of the underworld, made a deal with Zeus. He liked Persephone, and even though she was the daughter of a goddess, he made a deal with the king of the gods that he could take her off, abduct her, and steal her down to be his wife in the underworld with his three-headed dog, Cerberus of the underworld. Famous statue by Bernini of this event. And the mother, who's left behind on earth, is cast into deep mourning. This shows her as a young and beautiful woman, partly because it's showing her hair as the grain that she is a goddess of. Ceres, it's like cereal. But when Ceres goes into mourning, the earth starts to dry up. The flowers fall from her hair, and the earth is no longer bearing the plants that people need to survive. The earth is going into winter, and you may know this story. So she tries to get Persephone back, and she makes a deal with Zeus to get her daughter back if Persephone has not eaten anything while she was in the underworld. But as you know, she had a few pieces of a pomegranate. And so Persephone is bound to stay in the underworld for 6 months when it's winter here on Earth. And then she can come back and be with her mother for the other 6 months because she didn't eat very much. And then it's summer in this world. Here's another image of Ceres Demeter, not mourning, but it's a later image. It's a Dutch image again, a print. Ceres, as carrying the baskets of grain through a field of grain, the grain that people need to survive. So again, a kind of maternal goddess, a goddess who provides for the earth when she's not in mourning and for the people. Now, in this very small image, which I apologize for because I couldn't get a better photograph of it, and when I blew it up bigger, it got very grainy. I wanted you to see a different kind of mother goddess or nurturer. In the northern countries, in Northern Europe, in Britain and parts of Germany and up in Norway and even up in Iceland, you rely on the gods and goddesses to give you different kinds of food. You may not have as long a growing season, for instance, in Iceland. So they interpret this image to, well, they know that it is a piece, was found in England. It's a plaque that was done during the Roman domination of Britain, when the old Celtic gods and goddesses were confronted with the new Roman gods. So this is supposed to be the Roman god Mercury, or Hermes, you may know him by. He has a rooster here. He has various symbols of Hermes. And what's happened is he is paired here as if he's the husband of a local goddess whose name was Rosmerta. And this is a pattern that we see a lot. If in a locality there had been goddesses, but now a new religion's coming in with conquerors and it's a more patriarchal religion with gods, then the easiest way to combine them is to say to the people, well, your goddess is now marrying Mercury, so you have a husband and wife ruling you, or being your gods. Now, Rosmerta is an interesting figure that many speculations have been made about, because we see these strange things where she's holding a pole, or some people think it's a big spoon. And here she's holding a little cup and she seems to be pouring something into a tub, which is always by her. So this really fascinated me. The answer that they've come up with is that in the northern countries, it was important that women, and by extension goddesses, would take care of furnishing milk from the cows, which could be grazed in northern countries. churning it into butter or into cheese, and that some of that stuff could be saved for harder times. So Rosmerta may hold in her hand not a staff of mercury, which some people say, and not a walking stick, but part of a churn. Now, again, I have to ask your indulgence because this is a bad drawing. It's trying to show you that it was carved in stone. But you may see a figure here of a woman in a long gown. And this time the stick is in the tub or the bucket because she's at work churning the butter or cheese for her people. So instead of providing like a cornucopia with fruits and vegetables coming out of it, as you see in more southern climates, she provides milk and the products of milk for her people as a goddess as a maternal goddess who takes care of them. And here, of course, another way that women provide milk is to suckle the baby. This is the very famous and well-loved goddess Isis, an Egyptian goddess, who here is suckling her son Horus at a time when they've been separated from her husband, who's basically dead, who's been killed, and they're hiding in the marshes. And we have here sort of a single mom who has to do everything for her son, protect him, cure him when he gets sick and he gets scorpion bites and gets bit by snakes and things, all kinds of things happen. And she has to provide food in the only way she can sometimes, which is by suckling him at her breast. Now, this image of Isis can be identified partly by Horus, the baby on her lap, but also by her crown, the horns, and the sun symbol, and the uraeus, the little snake, the cobra symbol, which indicates royalty and also divinity. And we have the stories about Isis. We know she was deeply involved in Egyptian culture and belief. But before we leave this picture of her sitting, holding her baby and giving him milk, I hope it may bring into your mind, and I don't mean to be sacrilegious with this, images of Mary holding Jesus on her lap, because Isis was worshipped so long that her religion was carried from Egypt over into the Roman world. And there was actually a cult of Isis that was concurrent with, was contemporary with the time when Jesus lived. So people think just the format of this, mother holding baby and sometimes feeding the baby from her breast, became part of the art that was Christian art, famous Christian art. Now, here we don't see references to Christian art. I'm going to show you part of the story of Isis and Osiris, because Isis is, when I defined the lecture, described this lecture, I said some of the goddesses were, fabulous wives and mothers, and others were not. Well, Isis probably wins the title as best mother and best wife, because her husband was, well, you may know this, that we're seeing it on a papyrus for the dead, and you have Isis supporting her husband Osiris, who looks different because he's mummified. That's why he's all covered in this white, these are white bandages. But Osiris had been a king, so he bears the crown, I think it's of Upper Egypt, with the uraeus and the flail and the crook that mark him as king. He was said to be the first king of Egypt. And because he was a king, he incurred the jealousy of his brother Set. And Set worked out a plan to get rid of Osiris. Now, it didn't help that Osiris, according to some legends, according to the Greeks who wrote down some of the Egyptian legends, slept with Seth's wife, who looks usually identical to Isis. So some of the Egyptologists say, well, it's no wonder he couldn't tell them apart. But this was a great sin, of course, to Seth, and he was furious with Osiris. So he invites all the gods and goddesses to a big party. And he says, there's a door prize. I have this fabulous, beautifully made coffin, but it will only fit, it's made to a certain size. So I will give it to the person who fits in it. It's sort of like the shoe of Cinderella, right? So all the gods and goddesses try sitting in it, and it doesn't fit any of them. And then Osiris lies down in it, fits perfectly because it's been measured to his size. And Seth has 72 attendants who run out, hammer the top of the coffin shut, and they throw Isis and the coffin into the river Nile. So Osiris is gone. And Isis, as well as Nephthys, her sister who slept with Osiris once, go into deep mourning and into distress, and they search for Osiris's body. They search for that coffin. And to do that, they have to go down the river. So here's a piece by a modern artist, by someone who's known to me. It's by my sister. This is the boat in which Isis rides through the reeds, because of course the Nile is a river, not an ocean, so there are reeds coming up around it, and you have her footprints in it as she searches and searches for the coffin, but to no avail, because it turns out that the coffin was carried by the Nile down to the ocean and was taken off to Phoenicia. Isis finds this out through her various sleuthing. I mean, she's extremely devoted. She goes and becomes a nursemaid at the court, where Osiris's his coffin has become part of a pillar in a palace. And by earning credit with the king and queen there, she finally reveals to them that she is a queen and her husband is encased in this pillar, and they give it to her. And she's just about to bring him back to life with her goddess-like magic, when Seth reappears and tears the body of Osiris into 14 pieces, scattering the pieces all over Egypt. So once again, Nephthys, whom you've seen here, and Isis, whom you see here, have to go searching for the pieces of Osiris with not much hope of bringing him back to life. However, Isis succeeds in finding almost all the pieces, enough so that she can get herself pregnant by her dead husband and bring up the baby whom you saw in her lap, Horus, even without her husband being around. Nevertheless, the pieces, once reconstructed, oops, I went forward when I didn't mean to, form a resurrected body. This is something called the Jed pillar, which was like a maypole tree that for festivals they would raise up to be standing up like a human being. And here it's a symbol of all the pieces of Osiris that have been put back together. And you have his arms with the crook and the flail to show that it's Osiris. And the two women are in awe and in joy that he has been resurrected, although he's only resurrected as so far as to be a king of the underworld. He doesn't come back to life on earth. Nevertheless, his son is born, and his son, Horus, sometimes takes the form of a falcon. So what you're seeing up here, a falcon hawk. So what you're seeing up here is the beginning of a new day. The hawk flies through the air. This is the sun symbol. The baboons all rejoice because it's daytime. And with this new day, this rebirth of the day, you have the rebirth, in a sense, of Osiris. So Isis becomes a goddess dealing with life and death and able to bring someone sort of back from the death. Now here we have Osiris's body in his tomb, and it's being guarded by two birds. Who are the birds? Well, you might guess by looking back at this. Look at the strange crowns they have. I've never been able to figure out Nephthys's crown, but Isis's crown is a throne. It has a back like a chair and a seat, because Isis props up her husband, and then she props up her son, and she makes them kings, and she is their throne. And actually, this is an idea that worked its way into Christianity too. Mary is sometimes said to be the seat of God. So here you have these two women symbolized by their thrones, but while Osiris is dead, they mourn for him with wailing cries. It's an elaborate mourning. And the cries are like the sounds of these birds, kites, who when they fly through the air sound as if they're wailing in sorrow. So we have bird imagery. The goddess appears no longer in human form, but the goddess is as birds.
Laura?
Yes.
I sorry to interrupt. I wanted to wait to hear all of that because it was so spellbinding, but we are a little bit past 7. So I just want to tell our audience that we do want to respect their time. If they have to leave us, we will have a recording up tomorrow, but we're hoping you can stay with us. And with that, we will, I know you have a few more minutes to wrap up, so let's
Okay.
give it a few more minutes. And if you can stay with us, please do.
If you want to submit questions, I think Donna will be willing to send me questions. If you have to leave now, I'd be glad to try to answer them in written form, I guess.
Sure, just send them to us at the library and we will be, or even post them in the chat and we will copy them out of there and forward them off.
Right, and
We can,
Donna and I have also decided that I should give her a list of some of these strange names of the goddesses and gods, so you can at least have them in written form and look up more about them if you want to. So I'm trying to think, I think maybe I'm going to jump ahead. This is Maat, another Egyptian goddess who is recognizable by her feather. She is a goddess of justice and truth. And you probably have seen this kind of scene at the Field Museum, if you've been to Chicago's Field Museum, the Egyptian section, in which the dead soul, hoping to get to rebirth like Osiris, has his heart weighed by Anubis, who is the son of Nephthys. And what it's weighed against on this balance is the feather of truth. If the heart is too heavy, it means the person is not telling the truth about his deeds in his earthly life, and then he's eaten. But in this picture, we don't even have the crocodile-like creature that eats him. So we have a feeling that this guy passed the test. And indeed, the scale is like equally balanced. He's not heavier than the feather of Maat. But Maat made me think about lots of goddesses who are sort of abstract concepts. For instance, this picture by Dürer is a goddess who's known as Nemesis. And I talked to my sister about this last night. She said, but Nemesis means your enemy. And I said, well, originally what Nemesis was a goddess who put things to right. She was a goddess who maintained order in the universe. And the idea was, if someone got too wealthy and got too much power and took too much land, too many wives, too much stuff, he was going beyond his means. And he was engendering in other people repugnance, they said, or anger, that why is this guy taking more and more and more? This is not fair. And so Nemesis flies here over the world, over a mountain town in the Tyrol, and she's looking for injustices, which she will bridle. This is a horse's bridle. She will stop these people from taking too much. And often it's by bringing them to grief. It's often by killing them in some way or forcing some terrible punishment on them. So she's not a friendly goddess per se, but she's a goddess who brings justice. So people who cry out against the injustice of someone taking something that's not his share would appeal to her. Now, we also have the goddesses who were the fates, shown here in a picture by Francisco Goya, the fates who would measure out your life as a thread. This is the goddess in the back. These are old, ancient goddesses who looks through sort of a glass because she can't see the thread, and she's going to measure the thread out. And then Atropos, the last fate, is going to cut the thread short, which ends the life. This figure, strangely enough, who's so prominent, we think might be the person whose life is being measured out. And this was in a time when Goya was deaf. Things were going badly for him. This was his dark period. And so you have this very dark painting of the fates, the Greek fates, who were goddesses. As was this goddess, Nyx, who was the goddess of night, a very ancient goddess. Here she's engaged in a battle that the gods fought against the giants for rule of the universe. But Nyx was famous for bringing into the world all kinds of human qualities that might be considered kind of negative. For instance, one of her children was Nemesis, who punishes people. One of her children was jealousy. One was death. The fates, whom we just saw in Goya's painting, were some of her children. She even brought into the world the Furies, who take violent revenge on people for misdeeds. So, and interestingly, I also saw that one of her children was dreams. So I guess they're thinking of dreams as nightmares and not as pleasant dreams. Nyx is not often shown in art, so I had to include this one picture, this one carving of her on an altar of Zeus. in Pergamon in Turkey. This is a more modern, well, not modern, it's 1862, I think. It's a painting by Bouguereau, depicting an episode from a famous Greek play. Orestes, the young man who is trying to escape the Furies here, who are furiously just beginning their hunt on him. Orestes was the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. Agamemnon was killed by his wife, Clytemnestra, in vengeance for another misdeed. But her children were furious that the mother had killed their father, who had finally come back from the Trojan War. So Orestes goes to an oracle who tells him, you should kill your mother in vengeance for the killing of your father. So that's why we see this woman with the knife in her chest. But as soon as she dies, the Furies attack him, despite the fact that a god has told him to take revenge. The Furies say, it is against the normal law of things for a son to kill his mother, so we're going to hunt you down. And it's only by the intervention of the goddess Athena, who I'm going to have to jump ahead to here. There she is. Athena takes part in the trial of Orestes, and she kind of waits it. The Furies get to say their piece, that he's broken, primal laws by killing a parent. And Athena casts the final vote that says, but there was a reason for this. He was told to do this. So Athena is also, surprisingly from this story, is supposed to be a goddess of justice and trying to keep order. In fact, in the Olympian god, among the Olympian gods, it's said that even though Athena is a goddess of war, and you see her here in this painting by Gustav Klimt with her helmet on, she's a goddess only of war that's fought in a just cause. It isn't like, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to take sides here. It isn't like Russia invading Ukraine and saying, okay, now I'm taking over Ukraine. It's supposed to be a just war where she goes to bat for someone. And on her chest is the symbol of the Gorgon, whom we slipped past here really fast. This figure who is sometimes put on temples, who is also a goddess, who is a sister to Medusa, because she has snaky hair and snakes on her belt, who is meant to scare away evil. And when Medusa's head was cut off, it was given to Athena, who aided the person killing Medusa by helping him to conquer her. And so the head was put on Athena's armor, which is what we're seeing here. And in this strange picture by Klimt, we're having in the background Hercules, who is another one of the people whom Athena helped, fighting against one of his bitter enemies. This little figure here is a figure that in some pictures of Athena would be a symbol of balance and order, but here they think Klimt is changing it. They say that she's holding a mirror. So she is nude truth. Truth holds up a mirror to us to show us what we should see. And she's nude. She's not hiding anything. She's not concealing anything. So we have Athena as a purveyor of justice that way. Oh boy. Well, all right, let me see if I can quickly go to my very last slide. Here are the last slides. I wanted to talk once again about the balance between gods and goddesses, or between men and women. For instance, Thetis was a very ancient goddess who was able to change herself into all kinds of things like a lion or snakes. She had been sought in marriage by Zeus and Poseidon, but they decided against it when they heard it was foretold that her child would be greater than his father. So they let a mortal man, Peleus, try to win her as his wife. And Peleus did this with their advice, which was, hold on to her. No matter what she changes herself into, just keep holding on, and eventually she'll have to marry you, which she does, but it doesn't lead to very good results because the Trojan War ensues at this point. And now we have Thetis really brought low, because here she is appealing to Zeus, who almost looks like a statue in this painting by Ingres, the famous French artist of the 19th century. This painting's from 1911. Thetis had a son with Peleus, the mortal man, and her son was Achilles. And she tried to make her son immortal. Remember, there's a story of her dipping him in the river of immortality, or the water of immortality, but because she holds the baby by his heel, the heel is mortal. And so eventually Achilles can be killed at that heel. But here, Achilles is in trouble in the war, and Thetis has to abase herself by appealing to the god Zeus to save her son. So you have here, I'm going to end with, this is kind of, I was going to show you a more balanced view in India, but we'll end with this view. It was one slide I thought about beginning with, because you have here a feeling of the new order, which is the order of the male gods as being supreme, while the female gods who might once have been supreme are now having to appeal to them for favors. So I'm going to end there.
Are you sure, Laura? We'd sure love to see the India.
You want to see? Okay, all right. We'll do two.
Yeah, and the next time we schedule a program, we have to plan 2 hours.
I know, it's terrible. All right, in India, there is a concept called Shakti, Shakti means energy. So we have here one of the main gods, Vishnu, and we have his wife, his partner, Shri, who means luck. And they are sort of entwined together. She's sitting on his lap or on one knee. Down below, we have the little figure of Garuda, who's supposed to be a part bird, part man, and he is the animal part. So often with these gods, you have a triad. You have male god, female goddess, and then the mount, they call it, the thing that gets them around, which in some cases is a bull, in this case it's a winged figure. But the idea is that Vishnu and Shiva, we're going to see, are powerful gods, but sometimes they encounter something that's more powerful than they are. And then they have to turn to their wives. They have to find the right wife who embodies their energy. And when they join with her in marriage, in long-term union, let's say, the two energies combine. Vishnu is like the consciousness. The woman, Shri, is energy, cosmic energy, and together they're sort of unbeatable. And we see it one more time here. This is the god Shiva in one of the famous caves at Ellora in India. That's why the lighting is so odd, because this was actually carved into the cave wall. And you have the very beautiful Parvati, who's the daughter of a mountain, also a goddess, who is leaning on Shiva as her support. But actually Parvati, when you know all the stories about her, is spirited just like Inanna, and had many times has proven to Shiva that she is, worth considering in his plans. In this case, though, it's too bad Shiva's body is broken, because his knee is broken off here. You see his foot down below. The leg would have gone to the foot. And I didn't show you the whole cave, but down below this foot is a demon whom they have conquered together. And the demon is an earthquake demon. He's trying to shake the cave and destroy it. But Shiva controls him just by keeping his foot firmly on top of Ravana to keep him from upsetting the world. And this is their couple in their sort of idyllic mountain retreat, despite the presence of a demon down below. So I've left out a lot, but you see, you often see the Hindu gods paired, male and female, to produce a greater power. Although you might say it's still, it's still male dominated. He's larger in scale than she is, sort of the way Zeus is much larger than Thetis in that picture I showed you. But it's described as a unified power. Okay, so that's actually the last slide. There we go.
Laura, on that point about the figures being proportioned so that the male is larger than the female, is that conclusive that it is because the male is shown to be at least slightly more dominant, or is it because men are just generally larger size than women?
It's probably because they're bigger, but I should say it does happen in pictures of goddesses too. I didn't show you one picture of the battle. I showed you another picture of it. There was the goddess mother of the earth coming up from below to fight the Olympian gods. And she is huge compared even to Zeus or Poseidon. So we think that that's a different system of art, but often in these ancient systems of art, size, it isn't necessarily male is stronger. It's whatever is stronger is made bigger scale. Because here they're almost the same scale, but I could show you others where I think in the picture of Zeus with Thetis on his lap, he is so much bigger in scale than she is that he looks almost like a gigantic statue. And it's to show the power, who has the power. It's like a visual symbol of who's got the power in this picture, the bigger power. Does that kind of answer it?
Yeah, just an interesting way of looking at it. I assumed that you know what you said was correct, but I just wondered also if it was just that generally speaking, in human beings, men have a
A bigger physique,
taller
bigger
stature
body.
than women do.
Yeah, that's true.
And
So
I was wondering about her hand on his arm, on his
Yeah.
upper arm,
Yes.
and if that was some of her power restraining him.
Well, it could be. I have to say, I think his hand is broken. It isn't supposed to be skeletal like this. I think this is some broken piece, just the way his leg is broken. It could be, or it could be, I mean, it's hard to know. I thought of it as sort of drawing strength from him, like, you are my rock, I lean against you. But it might be a restraining power too. And there are stories, well, we left out Kali. The Hindu goddesses, and the gods sometimes, but the Hindu goddesses particularly often take different forms depending on their emotional state at the time. So beautiful, sweet Parvati, who's lounging around here, can appear as Kali, who is a death-like goddess. And she dances on Shiva to teach him a lesson. His body is prostrate, like lying on the ground, and she gets up on top of him and dances on him. And then I read something very funny recently. Sometimes when they show Kali, they show her sticking her tongue out, the way the Gorgon was sticking her tongue out in this picture much earlier. Where is it? Like, this is a tongue stuck out. I read that in India, sticking your tongue out can mean you're embarrassed. So some people interpret Kali sticking her tongue out as, oh, I'm dancing on my husband. What am I doing? I shouldn't be doing that. So I mean, it's interesting. It might just be in certain parts of India that's true, but it's funny because the sticking the tongue out, which I didn't point out before, is part of what's supposed to be making these creatures, these goddesses, seem fearsome. And it does in a way. It makes their face less beautiful. Here's Kali as a kind of skeletal figure. But here is Athena, firm as a warrior, but still quite beautiful, I would say. So it depends. It also depends how they want to use the quality of beauty. My sister told me that she taught Hindu kids when she was teaching in California, and the little girls, if my sister mentioned the name of Kali, the little girls would say, no, don't mention her name. It was a name that was not supposed to be mentioned because she's so much associated with death. But there are cults devoted to Kali, despite the fact that she's wrinkled up and skeletal and frightening, frightening and violent. There are temples to her and people who worship her. So it's an interesting religious world. That's all I can say. Yeah.
What we need here is part 3. Just
no.
to think about getting that on the calendar. I think we will have to.
We have to end it now. Yes.
End for tonight.
Thank you for being patient with me, everyone.
Well, thank you for such an informative presentation. My head is spinning. I have never heard that entire story of Isis and Osiris, and I can't wait to put the recording up because I want to hear it again. Anyone who has questions, please forward them to us, and we will make sure that Laura gets them, and we'll all post the answers.
It looks like there's some things in chat. I did find the seated woman of Çatalhöyük in Wikipedia. Yeah. Oh, and people said they liked it. That's nice. Thank you, everyone.
And the abbreviation you were looking for, of course, I know you know this, is CE for Christian era.
Yes.
Instead of,
right.
Anno Domini.
Right. Exactly. Thank you.
Exactly. So,
is it ACE? No,
it's BCE is before Christian era, and then CE is Christian era, which is the same as AD for Anno Domini.
Yeah, thank you.
So, well, that high school Latin comes back occasionally.
Yeah,
anyway. Okay, well, thank you everyone for sticking with us. Please send us your questions. Laura, please think about part 3 if you want to give yourself a rest.
I'm sorry
Um,
I went so long. I really am. But there was
No,
so
and you know what? We should know that a topic this
big.
insightful probably deserves more time.
Well,
And I think we'll plan accordingly next time. And
thanks for inviting me to do it. I learned a lot from doing it. So,
well, thank you. And I want to thank our audience. And any closing comments, Laura?
no, except to say that there is, a lot of feminist groups say, and I consider myself a feminist, but I don't go as far as to say that there was definitely a mother goddess who reigned over a culture that had no war, because now they can even prove that on Crete there were, battles and things. But it's interesting to see how often people will assume that a culture that was weighted towards the feminine might have different qualities than our current culture. I'm assuming that it's still weighted towards men here, but I think that's an assumption. But it's interesting to see how and I say that despite the fact that I ended with images of very fearsome goddesses who were destructive and violent and out of control in certain cases. So it isn't a quality that's exclusive to, fighting men. The goddesses shared it with them. So it's not as clear cut a world as some documents say. And if anyone wants to know books that I consulted, I would be willing to send out a list. And I found some books were maybe too popularized and, contained some mistakes that other books didn't seem to back up. So it's an interesting review of books that has to happen with this too.
We would love to have those book
Okay.
titles. We would post the bibliography. And if you have comments about the books, you want to associate with them about
Okay.
your
My
thoughts
experience
that
with
some
them,
things
yeah.
might be too,
Well, also
popular.
it got confusing because now with video games, they take the names of the gods and goddesses and they're different. So if you look something up on the internet, sometimes you get the video game version of that god, but it's very tricky.
There we go, 21st century. What can you
Yeah,
say?
that's right. So
Well, thank you
have a good
again,
evening.
Laura. We will
You're
watch for all of those resources and we will get them posted as soon
Okay.
as we receive them from you. The video will be up tomorrow. I want to thank our audience again. Please complete the pop-up survey that will appear when we close the Zoom link. And Laura, again, thank you. And with that, we'll say good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.